Thanks for coming on, man. It's really, I'm really excited to talk to you. Before we start, introduce yourself, let everybody know what you do and what you're about, and we'll get started, man.
Sure. My name is Kawena'ulaokalā, Kapahua. I'm a Hawaiian organizer and independence activist here in Hawaii. I'm from the island of Oahu, which is the capital island of Hawaii. And I'm involved with a couple movements here, from the Hawaiian independence movement, as well as some other movements, including some labor organizing around the university and the protection of Mauna Kea and other Hawaiian sacred spaces.
Very nice. Do me a favor, move your screen up a little bit because you're cutting off the top of your head. There you go.
For that.
Perfect. I brought you on because I think it was in October that I wrote this piece comparing Hawaii. I mean, I've done it a lot, comparing Hawaii to Puerto Rico, because it's just so obvious as a Puerto Rican and somebody who knows about American history. They're trying to make Puerto Rico the next Hawaii, right? And they've been trying to do it for 100 years. And so I wrote this piece, because I just read a book on the last queen of Hawaii, Queen Lulu. Right?
Liliuokalani.
How do you say her name?
Liliuokalani.
Liliuokalani.
Yeah.
And I mean, she was badass. I mean, I don't know if that's disrespectful to say, but she was badass, man. Smart and fierce and brave and just badass. And just reading about how, the book covers basically from when the British, Cook lands there in 1776, something like that. Isn't like the same year that the Declaration of Independence is written.
Yep.
That the British, are just landing in Hawaii, and that starts the end of. That's the beginning of everything. That's the beginning of the end, right?
Basically.
And just going through the way the book goes through how the British, or you could just say the white man, right? Because then it's the British, and then it's the French. The French try to get in there, but then it's ultimately America. But they all have the same strategy. They come in, ask for a little bit of rights, a little bit, just like they did with the Indians, in the mainland. Just give us a little space. We're just here. We're just visiting. Give us a little colony. We won't bother you. And then they ask for more, and then they ask for more, and then they ask for more, and then they eventually run everything. And as a Puerto Rican, same thing happens in Puerto Rico, right? They land in Puerto Rico, and they try to get rid of the language. They try to get rid of the customs. The customs are backward. You guys are backward. We're bringing white civilization, white religion. We're bringing you democracy. We're bringing you all this stuff. Why are you guys fighting us? And then, so that was like in October I wrote that for Latino Rebels. And like a month ago or so, you had this thread where you're comparing Puerto Rico and Hawaii. And somebody had tagged me because they're like, hey, this is kind of what you were talking about, but from the Hawaiian perspective. And as soon as I saw I read the whole thread, but as soon as I saw what you were tweeting about, I'm like, okay, I have to have this guy on. And thank you for coming on. First of all, let everybody know, because I guess people, I have friends who go to Hawaii all the time, right? Every year they go for their family. They go to Maui. They go to the resort. They don't know anything about Hawaiian history. They don't know anything about Hawaiian culture. They don't know anything. And so let everybody know what the political situation is in Hawaii. And by that, I mean, I guess most Americans would think that there's no independence movement in Hawaii. Nobody wants Hawaii to be independent, but that's not true, right?
Yeah. So after, like you said earlier, Captain Cook landed in Hawaii in about 1776 and then got his ass killed. And basically after that,
the spot where he got killed is on Oahu, right?
No, it's on Hawaii Island. So it's the biggest island. He got killed at a spot called Kealakekua Bay.
Right on the beach, right?
Yep. And there's actually a plaque where he died now on the beach, which is now underwater. But basically after that, other foreigners started coming to Hawaii. And we around that, right after that time, Kamehameha I unifies all of the islands and establishes the Hawaiian Kingdom, and we start modernizing as a nation to try and survive European colonization and imperialism. And so we, throughout this time period from about 1820 to 1893, Hawaii is quickly modernizing. Literacy, we establish universal education, or like mandatory education. Universal healthcare is something that's developed. We start building up a very formidable economy and all these other things. And then eventually in 1893, with the help of US Marines, which are docked in the harbor, white Americans overthrow the kingdom. And ever since then, there's been a movement to restore our independence. So one of the first things that happened after that, the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom, was a group of Hawaiians got together, took some guns, and tried to fight to take the kingdom back. But you have to remember that when Captain Cook arrives in 1776, there's almost 1 million Hawaiians alive. In 1893, when they overthrow our country, there's maybe 40,000 of us left. And so that's almost 90+% of our population gone in a tiny amount of time. And so there's one of the reasons Lili'uokalani surrenders is because she's afraid if she goes to war with America, we go extinct, which is a pretty astute observation. And so in the attempt to retake the throne fails, and basically a group of Hawaiians start organizing a grassroots movement to try and oppose annexation. And they go around the islands with petitions called the Ku'e petitions. Basically, they're anti-annexation. And if there's around 40,000, 39,000 Hawaiians alive at the time, almost every Hawaiian alive signs these petitions. If you're Hawaiian today, you can trace your ancestry to someone who signed this petition.
Wow.
Which is fairly incredible. And that's the kind of organizing that's been going on for 128 years under US occupation. Because since that happened, when the U.S. took over, they tried to ban our language, and they banned a lot of our culture while at the same time commodifying it to advertise for tourism. And so in the 1960s and 70s, the Vietnam War is going on. There's a lot of movement around organizing against the United States. The Cold War is on. And so basically what's happening is the U.S. is using an entire island called Ko'olave as a bombing target. And they've been bombing it so hard that they literally crack the island open, and it loses its water table. So basically all the fresh water under the island rushes out because they bombed it so hard because they broke a hole in it. And so Hawaiians decide that they're going to take back this island. And so they established this thing called the Protect Ko'olave Ohana, or the Protect Ko'olave family. And they go across basically, it's not a far swim, it's a couple miles maybe, and so they take a boat from one island to Ko'olave. They sneak onto the island.
I like how you said, I just cut you off there. I mean, you're an islander, so I like how you said it's not a far swim.
I mean, it's not that far. And so they sneak onto this island and hide in the caves while the U.S. military is still bombing this island. And basically, this starts what we call the Hawaiian Renaissance. It's a rebirth of Hawaiian culture. Renaissance.
What year was this?
This was in the 70s.
Oh,
so think around late 70s, like 77-ish. And so that starts a revitalization of our culture. There's a lot of other things that go on at the same time. There's this thing that comes out about the fact that there's only 300 speakers of the Hawaiian language left. And then also at the same time, there's this movement to basically there was like a really racist eugenics kind of movement that was around, of basically saying that Polynesians ended up in the Pacific Islands by accident. We like drifted over on driftwood. Right. There's no way we could have sailed before the Europeans understood that you didn't. And now they found
now you know, honest scholars say that the Polynesians were the greatest, you know, sea navigators of the ancient world. Right. We think of like Greece and stuff like that, but no, the Polynesians, I mean, they even went to like Easter Island. They even went to like South America.
Yep. So the reason that's now believed is because we had to prove them wrong.
Right.
They built what's called the hokulea. It's a voyaging canoe here in Hawaii. They built it, and basically they don't use any modern navigational instruments. They use the stars and the wind and the waves. And they went all the way to Tahiti. And a couple of years ago, they went all the way around the world with it. They circumnavigated the globe. Which is pretty incredible. But so all of these things are going on, and basically this activism around Hawaiian culture it starts growing into a movement because of one of this early struggle that takes place called the Kalama Valley struggle, which is actually, it's going to sound very similar to what's happening in PR. Basically, Kalama Valley was an agricultural valley on the east side of Oahu, where I am now, and it was inhabited by a lot of farmers. It was owned by a really wealthy land estate called the Bishop Estate. It was leasing the land to these farmers, but basically. This is around the 70s, right? So around this time, developers are coming to Hawaii. The tourism economy is starting to take off. And so they want to develop a lot of land to make luxury housing for foreigners to come and live. And so the state decides they're going to evict all the tenants and develop this into a luxury suburban area. And the farmers resist. They say they're not going to be evicted. And they start this group called Kokua Hawaii, which will eventually evolve into something that one of the more powerful organizing groups in Hawaii, similar to Black Panthers. But this is where the independence movement gets its radical core. And from there, the independence movement organizes to start a movement to retake Hawaii, to declare independence, to fight back against the military. And so in every struggle that comes up in Hawaiian activism over the next 4 or 5 decades, the independence movement is the thing driving it. So whether it's fighting evictions and gentrification in Waiahole and Waikane or Kalama Valley, which are they're trying to evict farmers to build condos, or the protecting of sacred land, such as the trying to stop the military highway called H3 that went through sacred land, or most recently the 30-meter telescope on Mauna Kea. It is the Hawaiian independence movement that's been driving it the entire time. If we're going to be honest, a lot of people, like you said, don't know about the Hawaiian independence movement. In Hawaii, a lot of Americans think we're just happy being American,
right?
Which is a lie. The Hawaiian independence movement is probably the most powerful social movement in Hawaii ever in history. Every year, thousands of people march and protest. Particularly, there's a couple major events that happen. One of them being the anniversary of the overthrow, which is January 17th of every year. We have what's called the Onipa'a March, which basically march from we have a graveyard where all of the monarchy, where all the royals are buried. And we march from there to the old palace. And so there's a lot of organizing and movement that happens around this. And the reason a lot of Americans don't hear about it is because how many news stories actually come out of here? Right. I mean, if thousands of people are protesting in America, you'll hear about it on the news. But here, it basically goes unnoticed. And so every major battle that's happened in terms of grassroots organizing here has been funded and pushed by the Hawaiian independence movement. And you know, one of the major accomplishments of this, one of the major reasons this has happened now is because the Hawaiian independence movement brought back a lot of Hawaiian cultural practices and established. They carved out places at the university.
The British, the British had banned the hula, like stuff like that, like just
the Hawaiian language was banned from being taught in schools up until like the 70s and 80s. And so this history isn't long ago. It's only very recently that we've begun to really take back a lot of these things. And so the Hawaiian independence movement is responsible for a lot of that. And it's still ongoing today, despite what people may think. I mean, the Hawaiian independence organizers like myself are the main ones fighting the militarization of Hawaii, fighting damage to our sacred spaces like TMT, or fighting the environmental degradation that's been happening. Like, for example, the U.S. Navy is currently polluting our main water source on this island with jet fuel.
And that bishop that was Queen Lulu, right? Am I saying her nick?
Liliuokalani. So Bishop Estate is actually it was originally started by this princess of the Hawaiian monarchy named Bernice Pauahi Bishop. It was founded after her death. The idea of it is it's supposed to be for the benefit of Hawaiians. However, her husband was white. And so we can kind of imagine how that went. Essentially, he's a very racist white man who doesn't believe Hawaiians should be self-governing. And basically she was one of the most land wealthy people in Hawaii. Right. He took her estate, which owned all this land, and basically just turned it into a real estate company. Which is something that we struggled with for a long time, because this estate also runs one of the main private schools in Hawaii that's supposed to be for Hawaiians to help our people get educated.
Which one is that?
It's called Kamehameha Schools. But basically, Bishop Estate at the time, it was very corrupt. It was run by mostly white men. One of the major problems with Bishop Estate is that the American regime in Hawaii, the state government, actually appoints the people who are in charge of this estate. which so it ends up being just another real estate company that makes a lot of money and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, so those are the kind of forces that the Hawaiian independence movement has been struggling against for over 40 years now. And
the east side of Oahu, isn't that where Barack Obama was given this lush seaside property by one of his Chicago real estate friends, and now they're trying to build a seawall to preserve the beach, but that actually destroys the beach.
Yeah. So if you look at beaches in Hawaii, this is another thing that the independence movement had, a lot of the organizers have fought, is basically the degradation of our environment. When white people move, or when wealthy people move into Hawaii, they put up walls and all these things to keep other people out. And when you build on the ocean, when you build on on the beach, it basically destroys the beach. The beach gets pushed out into the ocean and disappears. And so Obama he has his house in a town we call Waimanalo. It's a majority Hawaiian area. And it's right on the beach. It's this huge compound. And they want to build a seawall, I guess, for their privacy. However, the problem with that is on the other side, on the beach side of this property, there's this thing called a pahonu. It's basically a turtle pond. So basically, Hawaiians used to farm turtles. It's this pond where they would stay. These turtles would be farmed at, and it would be in the ocean, but they couldn't escape, kind of thing. It's a very old pond. It's a very old beach, and it's going to be destroyed if they let the seawall go through. And that's not even the only thing. The Obama property, it's actually built on several old Hawaiian burials. They found like bones and burials, and basically it's kind of atrocious. This isn't the only time it's ever happened, but they found these burials, and basically they wanted to build a swimming pool where they were. And so what they did is they dug them up, they put them in a storage cabinet. And in Hawaii, luckily enough, a lot of us are able to trace ourselves to where our ancestors are buried. And so the people who are descended from those burials were known. And so what they should have done is contacted those descendants to get their input on what was to happen. Right. But instead, what they did is they dug up those bones, put them in a filing cabinet, and built the swimming pool, and then talked to them and was like, well, we can't put the bones back. So what do you want to do with them now? And so this is rather commonplace. And
that's the whole strategy, right? Of the haole in Hawaii, right? They do something, and then Hawaiians get mad, and they're like, you can't do that. And then they go, oh, we already did it, so now you got to deal with it, you know?
Yep. Exactly.
And what I was going to say is, so Obama, obviously, was born in Hawaii. Mm-hmm. What's this feeling towards Obama in Hawaii? Obviously, he's not a native son, and he's not for, the independence or the preservation of Hawaii at all. He went to, what's the name of the school? Punahou? Yeah. No.
So Obama, funny enough, Punahou is one of the wealthiest schools in Hawaii. It has a reputation of being a very white, wealthy school.
I just read that the guy who wrote Melekalikimaka went there too. A white guy.
Yeah, makes sense. Punahou has a pretty bad rap. Primarily also because it was established by missionaries. So Obama, it depends. He's a Democrat. The Democratic Party basically controls Hawaii, which, contrary to popular belief, it's not like a one-party rule. Basically, if you want to win election in Hawaii, you run as a Democrat, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. Obama's pretty popular here, except among the Hawaiian independence movement. For a lot of reasons. Right, one, he's an American president coming from our occupied country. And another thing is he didn't really do anything for Hawaiians while he was in office. Yeah. And the other problem with that is also that he basically did the Asia Pacific pivot, which he turned the attention of the U.S. military from the Atlantic and Asia and Europe to focus on Asia and the Pacific, which meant a heavy militarizing of our islands.
That was the initial reason why white people settled Hawaii, right? They wanted a place to be able to like get coal, recoal their ships, refuel their ships. That's basically it, right?
Yeah. So when they wanted to annex Hawaii, the bill was dead in Congress. They couldn't pass the treaty because of those petitions I mentioned earlier. President McKinley at the time restarted the debate in Congress to annex Hawaii by saying that they needed Hawaii so America get their piece of China. Mm-hmm. So the point of having Hawaii was always to be the base of white supremacy and imperialism in the Pacific, so that the U.S. military could reach Asia and exploit people there. And so Obama continued that proud tradition of imperialism by helping the U.S. military focus in Hawaii and reorganize troops to focus on fighting China. And so Hawaii's borne a lot of the brunt of that. On my island, Oahu, 1/3 of the land is actually owned by the military. And it's if there's I can send you a map later. Basically, there's a map of all military land and water that's owned in Hawaii, and it's huge. It's more than 25% of the land in Hawaii is owned by the military. And at one point, when I was talking about the origins of the independence movement in the 70s, most land in Hawaii was owned by 8 people. Yeah, 8 people.
And that goes back to the colonial period, right? When, I mean, what's that guy who he owned? Well, there's Sanford Dole, right? The guy who his brother started Dole Pineapple Company, and he was president. I think he was the first white president of the colony, right? Sanford Dole.
So basically, when they overthrew the Hawaiian kingdom, basically, and this is actually a common misconception about the kingdom. The kingdom was a constitutional monarchy, but it elected its kings and queens. So Lili'uokalani's brother, who preceded her, he was elected in an election. Like they elected him as king, and when he passed away, his sister took over. When they overthrew Queen Lili'uokalani, they founded this fake puppet government of the United States called the Republic of Hawaii, and they ousted most of the Hawaiians from government, and it was run by a bunch of white supremacists, very open white supremacists. Sanford Dole was one of them. Lauren Thurston was another one. And basically, these were all the grandsons of missionaries who just become plantation-owning capitalists.
And then, the thing about the queen had married a white man who she lived in his house. He was like one of the richest white men, and he it was like a terrible marriage. Her mom was a bitch, and obviously, so I noticed on your Twitter, you say your location, Kingdom of Hawaii. So that tells me that like just like how we independence people talk about Puerto Rico. We say Borinquen, right? Mm-hmm. You guys are talking about Kingdom of Hawaii, or you guys call yourselves, if you're independence, proud Hawaiian, you call yourself Kanaka Maoli, right?
So Kanaka Maoli is just the word for Hawaiian in our language, actually. But so if you're a Hawaiian independence supporter, you tend to call yourself a Hawaiian national or something like that, because you're not a citizen of the United States, you're a citizen of the Kingdom of Hawaii, kind of thing. And so when I say I'm living in the Kingdom of Hawaii, it's because basically, the understanding amongst the independence movement is that Hawaii is occupied by the United States, because the only way under international law you can take hold of another country is through a bilateral treaty from both parties. U.S. didn't do that. What they did when they wanted to annex Hawaii is they passed this thing called the Newlands Resolution. And if you're familiar with how resolutions work in U.S. Congress, it's essentially the same as a law that only affects within its borders. So if the U.S. wanted to pass, let's say, a ban on smoking, they'd pass a law, and that wouldn't affect smoking in Mexico or Canada. But what they did was they basically said, well, what they did to Hawaii was the equivalent of them passing a law in Congress saying, we own Canada and Mexico now. And everyone just kind of went along with it. And so basically, because that's not a recognized reason under international law, what happened is America invaded Hawaii to overthrow our government. And so we've been occupied by them ever since, the same way they occupied, let's say, Iraq. And stuff like that. They invaded and overthrew a government, and then they just haven't left. Yeah,
and this is like what 1893, right? Mm-hmm. And so they invade Puerto Rico and Cuba and Philippines and Guam and Samoa in 98. So only 5 years later, and this is like in the 1890s that this guy wrote a book that all England and Germany and America loved, where he's talking about, if you want to be a strong country, you have to have a strong navy. And that's why Britain and America start looking at, we need to colonize islands, just so that basically they wanted Hawaii, like you said, just as a base for white supremacy in the Pacific. They took Puerto Rico for the same reason, only in the Caribbean, right? They wanted Cuba. I mean, they still want Cuba. That's the only reason why there's a blockade, right? Because America wanted to fuck Cuba in the ass, and Cuba says no. Cuba's still fighting, right? They rather starve. They rather be broke than to submit, right? And a popular, I guess, idea of what happened in Hawaii is that I hear it said that the America gave all, they flooded Hawaii with white settlers, quickly gave them voting rights and then stripped the voting rights of Native Hawaiians. And then had a, hey, do you guys want to be part of America? And obviously the white settlers said yes. Same thing happened in Texas, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep. So, and so basically when they overthrew Hawaii, like I said, people had voting rights in the Hawaiian Kingdom. Whereas in America at the time, you'd be a white man, you had to own land to vote. In Hawaii, if you became a citizen, you got to vote. It didn't matter. So a lot of Asian citizens who had moved to Hawaii and become naturalized citizens had voting power. And so when America moved in and overthrew our country, they didn't just take rights and voting power away from the Hawaiians. They stripped it of every person in Hawaii who wasn't white, which is the majority of the people. If you look at the population in 1900, there's about 2,000 white people in Hawaii. By the 1950s, when the statehood vote happens, it's almost 200,000 white people. And this is post-World War II, remember. So the U.S. military has built up massively in Hawaii because they've just ended the war. And basically what they do is they allow any person in Hawaii who's lived there for a year to vote, including U.S. military who've been stationed there for the duration of the war and will end up leaving soon after.
Right.
Because the UN at the time tells its main goal is decolonizing, right? So it puts Hawaii on the list of territories to be decolonized that have to be given self-governance. And so what the U.S. does instead is they do that vote of you either get to be a state or you remain a territory. And they don't give any other options. Yeah. And so when people are like, oh, well, you voted by 93% to become a state, that's false. Right. Because one, so many people have been politically disenfranchised. Many of them didn't even realize they could vote now. And then two, if you look at how many people actually partook in this election, only about 27% of the voting age populace actually voted yes. The majority of people either stayed home and didn't vote. There was a lot of blank ballots in this election, and people boycotted it because they wanted to protest it. So of course, the only people who are the statehood vote is going to win because the only people who took part in this election were statehood people because independence wasn't on the ballot. Yeah. They just were like, well, you either get to be a state or you remain a territory. And Hawaii at the time was basically a corporate. It was basically a corporate-run state. The 5 companies controlled everything on island. They were called the Big Five. All of them were like plantation companies, basically, one of them being the Dole Pineapple Company and all that. And so if we stayed as a territory, the idea was, well, we'll just be stuck with these corporate rulers who ruin our lives and we have to work 18-hour days and all these things. And so people tried to become a state to try and fix that, but it didn't work. And so when people make this argument about the statehood vote being what we really wanted, it's not true because there's no racial breakdown of who voted for what. So we don't know who the majority of the voters in Hawaii were. But I can almost guarantee you it wasn't most of the Hawaiians because many of the Hawaiians who were there were still independence supporters. Right. There was a famous quote from a territory representative at the time. Her name was Kamokila Campbell. And she, in the debates about the statehood vote, she said that I don't believe that we, the true native children of Hawaii, should give up our rights as the native people of this land for a thimble full of votes in Congress just to satisfy the greed of foreigners. And so this idea that we shouldn't, Hawaii deserved independence, and just because they were going to suddenly give us 2 electoral votes and give us 2 representatives in Congress wasn't enough to rectify the wrongs they had done to our people. Right. And if you look at what's happened in Hawaii today, from what I've understood, a lot of the statehood party in Puerto Rico tends to hold up Hawaii as the future of Puerto Rico. Yeah. Well, let me tell you, it's a nightmare. Don't do it. It's the statehood was probably one of the worst things that could have happened for Hawaiians. If you talk to a lot of kupuna who are grandparents, my Hawaiian comes out every so often. When you talk to grandparents who are alive at the time or elders who are alive at the time, a lot of them talk about Hawaii becoming a state as like a second annexation. It was a second time of losing their independence because it was just further solidifying American hegemony in our islands. And it didn't. People. One of the arguments I've heard is, well, being a state gave you more protections for your culture and da da da. It wasn't until almost 20 plus years later that our language actually unbanned in schools and that we actually got some control over our culture again.
There's a serious poverty problem, right, among Native Hawaiians. I mean, yes, there's a lot of rich people in Hawaii, but they're not native, right? They're
and so that was one thing I pointed out in that Twitter thread I made. Hawaii has the 4th most millionaires in America. And yet Hawaiians are half of the houseless population. We're one of the only states in America where the population is decreasing. And that's because Hawaiians are being forced into exile and by the thousands every year because we can't afford to live in our own homeland.
You're preaching to the choir, man. As Puerto Rican, you're preaching to the choir.
I mean, exactly. They're doing what they're doing to you. They did to us 40 years ago, and it's just an ongoing process. They haven't even changed their playbook. It's the exact same thing. In Puerto Rico, what was it, Act 2022 of them giving tax breaks to Americans to move to Puerto Rico? They basically did the same thing in Hawaii. They got which white Americans to move here. They had an immigration authority back in the day that basically put out ads in U.S. newspapers saying, we want the white man to come here. And essentially they wanted to replace the population of Asians and Hawaiians with white people. And so Act 2022 in Puerto Rico, they basically did the same thing in Hawaii. And I saw that, I forget what, that reporter was talking about that land that's supposed to be protected adjacent to her property being bought up to be turned into luxury condos. They're doing the same thing here. They tried to take an entire agricultural valley of Waiahole Waikane and turn it into what they call a second city and just build luxury condos in that valley. And they've been trying to do this for 40 years. And so now it's Puerto Rico's turn to face the colonialism.
Yeah. I mean, and a lot of people, we talk in the United States, we talk a lot about Pearl Harbor. And people know that's in Hawaii, but you rarely hear that Hawaii at the time was a colony, right? Mm-hmm. That and so not only is America being a colony of America, economically bad for Native Hawaiians, it's physically dangerous to be connected to this, psychotic empire, right? Because then you're the death and devastation that happened in Pearl Harbor. And Pearl Harbor, I read in that book, is an ancient sacred homeland of like the shark goddess. Mm-hmm. So these are holy places, and they're being destroyed by American capitalism and greed. And I read about how in the 1800s, how there's these every island had what is called the ulu, that bird, beautiful bird. Every island had its own bird, and in like 50 years. Because I guess the royals, the royal family, or if you were royal, you would wear have the feathers on your cape or on that stick, and they would hunt them, but they didn't hunt them like crazy, Yeah. But then the white man comes, and then these are pretty. Let's kill them all. All, and so now there's no birds like in the islands. And now the funny thing about, I mean, it's not funny, but it's just American colonialism right there. Now you guys in Hawaii are dealing with the koki, which is from Puerto Rico. Yep. The koki got to Hawaii somehow, and there's no natural predators. So now I hear, I haven't been to Hawaii yet. I plan on going. I want to go. All you hear at night is the koki, and the native Hawaiians must be pissed. Because their native birds are gone. There's more koki
here in Hawaii now. There's more koki in our islands now than in Puerto Rico. We have more koki than you guys, and it's your frog.
Yeah.
And it's funny too because Puerto Ricans, it's a cultural symbol of pride for you guys, right? Here, it's just kind of a loud annoyance in the middle of the night,
right?
Because like you said, there's no natural predators, and that's something that's happened over and over in Hawaii. It's one thing we have here, the mongoose. I don't know if you guys have it in Puerto Rico, but basically they brought the mongoose because white people brought rats, and they're like, well, now we need to get rid of the rats, and so they brought the mongoose to deal with it, not realizing that rats live at night and mongoose live at the day, and now we just have both of them, and they don't actually ever fight. And they both eat our birds, like you said. Like a lot of, unfortunately, native birds are one of like the prides of the islands, and unfortunately, we've lost many of them due to many different things, such as mosquitoes being brought, since there's different diseases, and then also
that's just right. There was no mosquitoes before the missionaries came. The missionaries brought the mosquitoes.
There wasn't just no mosquitoes. There wasn't any STIs in Hawaii. There was no sexually transmitted diseases. There was no mosquitoes. There was none of these things that white people brought that were synonymous with them arriving in native places. So essentially, Hawaii was very much an island paradise up until white people came, and now it's advertised as an island paradise. And rather than actually being a paradise, it's a hellhole for Hawaiians because of the struggles we go through every day just to survive in our own land.
And there's a deer problem too, right? I mean, I hear there's a deer's endemic, and deer's not from Hawaii, right? And but there's places there's some places where there's deer, like there's squirrels. There's more, you know.
It's an island called Molokai. There's about 7,000 people who live on that island. There are more deer on that island than people. And they were brought because white people wanted to hunt because they thought the islands would be a fun hunting reserve.
Wow.
You were talking about Pearl Harbor a little earlier, about the dangers that being an American territory holds for Hawaii. And that was really well shown a couple of years ago. I feel like a lot of people found out it happened, but we had a fake nuclear missile alert. This was back when Trump was posturing with North Korea. He was saber rattling. He was threatening them. And basically what happened is Hawaii has like a missile warning system. It sends out an alert to your phone if we're being attacked. Someone hit the wrong button at the missile warning station. And it sent out an alert to everybody's phone that a missile from North Korea was coming. It's a nuclear missile. We have 45 minutes. Which obviously caused a panic because you can't really do anything against a nuclear missile. You just die. And so for 45 minutes, everyone in Hawaii thought we were going to die. And so people were scrambling. People were shoving their kids into sewers to try and get them underground to hide. People were running for these tunnels that go through the mountains on these highways and trying to hide in there. Other people were calling their family members saying, I love you. This is the end. For 45 minutes, we didn't know. And then the reason they couldn't get the word out was because the governor forgot his Twitter password. And so he couldn't put the word out of like, this is a mistake. We didn't mean it. And there was no system to recall the alert that had been put out. And so that really exposed that Hawaii is not, there's this constant lie that we need America to protect us, because if America doesn't protect us, someone else is going to come and take us over, which is wholly false, because the Hawaiian Kingdom at the time had treaties with every single nation, almost every major power on the planet, that they respected our independence, the US being one of them, and they didn't listen. But the French and the British respected us and were fine just trading with us, because they understood that if Hawaii was independent, then no one else could control the Pacific. There's this lie of the US military protecting us, but that missile alert proved it wrong. America doesn't protect islands. It makes them a target because they use us as human shields against their enemies. They do the same thing. They did the same thing in Puerto Rico and Cuba. They did the same thing here and in Samoa and in the Philippines and in Guam. We're a network of island human shields for the US military to protect itself from its enemies, whether that's people in South America that they're trying to use the Caribbean as a network of human shields, whether that's the Pacific and they're trying to use us as a bodyguard against China or any other Asian power. The U.S. military doesn't protect islands. It consumes our islands and then makes us into just hostages that it holds in front of them in a gunfight. One of the similarities between Hawaii and Puerto Rico is the U.S. Navy using us as bombing sites. They did the same thing to Vieques that they did to Ko'olave. They tested Agent Orange on both of our islands, and we have areas of our islands that are so toxic that there's Superfund sites now. I know Vieques has it's a lake or something that has been so polluted it's toxic now. They did a similar thing here. Ko'olave is now still riddled with bombs. We're still trying to restore the island. There's other places, like you said, Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor wasn't just like a sacred area. It's called Pearl Harbor because there used to be thousands of pearls you could get in that area. There are no more pearls in that. They're gone. They'll never come back. This area was also extremely important for fishing. Basically, because of the way the harbor works, you're able to build rock walls and create fish farms in these different offshoots and estuaries. Those are all so toxic, I wouldn't eat a fish that came out of there now. And now there's an area bigger than an entire island of Ko'olave on the big island of Hawaii, or Hawaii Island. It's called Pohakuloa. It sits right between our two biggest mountains, Mauna Kea and Mauna Loa. And it's basically this huge, expansive lava field. And it's a very important place for Hawaiians. It's very sacred. The U.S. military has owned this land since around World War II, when they started seizing Hawaiian land for military bases. And they've been bombing this site forever. When we were up at Mauna Kea trying to stop the 30-meter telescope, Pohakuloa is a couple miles down the road. They would bomb it in the middle of the night, and you could see the flashes in the night. You could hear it, and you could feel the ground shake. And they've been bombing it with depleted uranium rounds. And so basically what they do, it's depleted uranium. They use it for like killing tanks and other things like that. Basically, they've just left that stuff out in the sun. And so when they bomb again, this depleted uranium gets into the dust. And so when they bomb, the dust gets knocked into the air. And now you have depleted uranium floated around in the air. And so obviously, this is a really great threat to the people who live around the area, but also under Pohakuloa, and the military seems to really do this on every island, we have what's called aquifers. It's basically Rainwater falls onto the islands, filters down through the lava rock into these large areas underneath the island. And
like underground lakes, basically, right?
Exactly, underground lakes. That's where we get all of our drinking water. So on Big Island, Pohakuloa, there's now depleted uranium sitting just above the main source of drinking water on the island. On my island of Oahu, there's a place called Red Hill, which the U.S. military uses as a fuel storage facility. The fuel tanks in there are so broken and old that the lining in the tanks is no thicker than 2 dimes put together. 2 dimes. And it's 100 feet above our drinking water. And it's a bunch of jet fuel. And it's been leaking for over 20 years. It's been leaking hundreds of thousands of gallons. And the U.S. Navy says they'll fix it in 40 years. Or they won't fix it at all because it's not a problem.
Yeah. They're just hoping you forget about it, right? I mean,
yeah, exactly. You'll forget about it until all of you start dropping dead from drinking jet fuel. So the U.S. military isn't just there. It's not meant to protect any island. It's actively poisoning us and getting away with it because the U.S. military controls everything in America. It's essentially a military fascist dictatorship at this point.
Yeah, I mean, it's the army of white supremacy, right? White capitalism in the world.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, America doesn't do what it says it's going to do. It doesn't bring you democracy, takes away your any democracy you had, and it doesn't bring you economic prosperity. It ruins your economy, makes you a monoculture, ruins your land. I mean, in the bombing, right? Like when you're talking about the bombing on the Big Island, that's a sacred area. They're doing that on purpose, right? They're trying to bomb the soul of every Hawaiian, and so you don't have enough fight in you left to fight for your independence. You just take it. It's they're sadistic, man. They're sadistic.
Yep. And it's one thing I honestly worry about with Puerto Rico a lot too, because where you guys are at is where we were earlier. And if you go down the same route we did, I'm afraid you'll end up the way we have. One of the things Puerto Rico people often tout for Puerto Rico becoming a state is the idea that it'll bring economic prosperity because Puerto Rico is currently being, neglected by the U.S. and so it's suffering economically. Hawaii, like I said, has a lot of millionaires, but majority of us are poor. The poverty line in Hawaii is extremely high because of the high cost of living, and Hawaiians make up most of the bottom echelon of society, while more Haules, gringos, move in to take over our land and all these things. And so the idea that the U.S. military or any U.S. entity would ever bring wealth or prosperity or safety to our islands it's the biggest lie ever told.
Yeah, I mean, in Hawaii, from what I read, I mean, there was really everything was royal land, but in the sense that the royal family understood that they were taking care of Hawaii. They were the protectors of Hawaii. And while it was royal land, the land belonged to everybody. And it was up to the royal family or the royals to take care of every Hawaiian, right? Make sure you had food and a home and everything.
Yep. So the way land division worked in Hawaii, because under a capitalist system of land ownership, we don't have us islands. We don't have an endless expanse of land for everyone to own. So what they did is they divided the land in 3 ways. There was the crown lands, which are owned by the monarchy, the government lands, which are owned between the nobles and all of that stuff, and then the common land, which is basically owned by the people. But despite that, who held the title to that land, everyone could live on anywhere. It didn't. If you were a farmer and you lived on land that was deemed land of the monarchy, they still let you live there, and you didn't have to pay a lease, you didn't have to pay rent, because people needed a place to live. Under the kingdom, there was no homelessness in Hawaii, none, zero. Everyone had a place to live, everyone had a roof over their head, everyone was taken care of. Now we have a huge houseless crisis because people continue to be forced into houselessness, and then houselessness is criminalized in Hawaii through these things called sit and lie bans, where it's illegal to sit or lie down on a sidewalk in the city. And the police basically go into houseless encampments and beat them out with sticks and use violent force to force them out of the city. And then until they're outside of the city in areas and rural areas, and they just create large tent cities basically because they have nowhere else to go.
That's crazy.
And so this land system was something created by Hawaiians that worked for Hawaiians. Everyone had places to live. We had, we still had this idea of commonly shared land that wasn't privatized yet. And now under America, most Hawaiians will never be able to even afford land in our lifetime. If America continues to own Hawaii, I will absolutely never be able to own a house in Hawaii, no matter how hard I work, because there's absolutely no way I can afford $1 million house on starvation wages.
And like you said, same thing's happening in Puerto Rico. The idea there is to young Hawaiians, especially you're intelligent, you got skills, so the temptation is to go to the mainland, right? And get a job and get a career and abandon your homeland. Same thing happened in Puerto Rico, right? Now there's more Puerto Ricans in United States than in Puerto Rico. Is that true of Hawaiians too? I'm in Vegas, so there's a lot of Hawaiians in Vegas.
Yeah, we're not quite there. We're almost there, and we'll probably if things keep up the way they're going, we'll probably reach that in the next decade easily, maybe even less. And yeah, like you said, same as Puerto Ricans, Hawaiians, because it's so hard for us to survive in Hawaii, we're forced into economic exile to go to the United States, into Las Vegas or California or Washington or Oregon, because the average house price in Hawaii is on my island at least, it's over $800,000, and on islands like Hawaii, it's almost $1 million. And that's the average.
Right.
So people aren't able to afford housing because of that. And then what you have now during the pandemic is because everyone's stuck at home, white Americans move to Hawaii because, I have nothing else to do. I can work remotely. I'll just move, which means they take up a lot of our housing, our low priced housing, and force Hawaiians onto the streets. And so now we have more homes than we do houseless people, but all those homes are empty luxury, empty luxury housing.
Yeah,
man, stumbling over this because it's so angry.
That's like in San Francisco, right? I mean, they have all these empty houses, but they're all, the average house is $1 million, and they have the biggest homeless population. And it's like, capitalism doesn't work. I don't understand how people don't see that capitalism does not work.
Nope. And it's absolutely obvious too, because we're seeing the complete destruction of capitalism play out in front of our eyes. All of us, with COVID pandemic, if we had all just stayed home for a couple months, we would be out of this already.
Yeah.
But instead, capitalism decided that our deaths were worth more.
We got to keep feeding the machine.
To the economy. Yep. And so now, not only are over 500,000 people dead in America from it, the economy is still in the tank, and it's not going to get any better anytime soon. And we're all going to suffer for it, while the rich and the ruling class and the billionaires continue to make money off of our deaths.
Well, yeah, during the pandemic, they gave the 1%. It was the largest transfer of wealth to the top in American history during a pandemic. That's the time to do a transfer of wealth to the bottom, not to the top.
Yep. And in Hawaii, I'm sure this is happening in Puerto Rico. In Hawaii, we're seeing that these economic effects of capitalism and American rule getting worse and worse and worse. People are getting poorer. For example, Hawaii is based on a tourism economy, right? And tourism tends to be super exploitative. Hawaiians make up the lowest earning jobs in tourism. So we're like, the housemaids, the pool boys, all that kind of stuff. We don't make a lot of money. And so now with tourism being dead, most of us were out of a job, and then they just failed to give us unemployment benefits for a long time. Many people are still waiting. They're still waiting. And so people are, we have basically an evictions crisis that's on the horizon because the majority of people who live in Hawaii are renting a house or renting an apartment. Almost over 1/3 of people in Hawaii who are renting are facing eviction because they're so behind on rent that if rent isn't canceled, they're going to be on the street when the evictions embargo is lifted. And those are families, those are elderly people, those are just average everyday people who are going to end up on the streets because capitalism decided that having a place to live is a privilege, not a right.
Privilege, yeah. I mean, and the whole tourism idea only works if there's a strong middle class, if everybody has money, but nobody has money to go to Hawaii. Like, first of all, going to Hawaii, just the plane ticket is expensive. And so it's mostly just a playground for rich white people.
Yep. And it's something that we've seen over and over again. From what I've understood, this is something that's also kind of happening in Puerto Rico, is that in Hawaii, we have a lot of land that's supposedly designated for agriculture. But what happens is rich white people, maybe such as Oprah or Mark Zuckerberg or any other Bitcoin tech bro who comes along, buys up these agricultural lands in Hawaii and then uses a loophole to basically build their plantation vacation house on it. And they farm grass, they farm palm trees. They don't farm anything that feeds us. They just get a luxury house out of it, and they take up agricultural land that we could be using to feed ourselves. Like Puerto Rico, Hawaii imports 80% of its food because we've become so dependent on the tourism economy that we can no longer feed ourselves if ships stop coming. And one of the problems with this tourism economy is that the money from it, when people come to Hawaii, they're like, oh, well, I'm helping the local economy. Your money's going to Marriott. It's going to Best Westin. It's going to all of these hotel corporations. It's not coming to us. And it's continuing to take up more land from us so that we have less places to live, less places to grow food, and more places for the rich corporations to make money off our backs.
Yeah, and it's sad. I mean, I got some friends who are bougie, right? Super bougie, yuppies, these types, right? They're not friends by choice. They're through family and stuff like that. But I'm friends with them, right? But, you know, sometimes you can't pick your friends. And so they're trying to go to Hawaii. They've been to Hawaii, and it's my first time. And I'm like, you know, I'm just reading about Hawaii, so I want to go to all the historical sites, and I want to, you know, I don't want to go to some fancy resort. I really don't want to go to Maui. I want to stay on Oahu and explore, you know, go to Punch Bowl and all that stuff. And they're like, no, there's this really 5-star place on Maui. We should stay there for like the whole week. I'm like, no, if you go to Hawaii to stay on a resort in Maui, then you don't even care where you are. You don't even care about the people there.
You could literally get any resort.
Right. Go to Cancun. Go to Cabo.
And one of the things people don't realize is Hawaii, the entire archipelago, is in a medically underserved area. When COVID was at its peak here, and when I say peak, I mean like we had maybe 200 cases a day. Our ER was full. We're running out of space in our hospitals. We already have a shortage of doctors. Like prior to COVID, we had a shortage of doctors because it's so expensive here that even doctors struggle to make a living here. And so we live in a medically underserved area. Pacific Islanders and Hawaiians are some of them have the least access to medical care. And so there was a stat that came out recently, just a couple of days ago, from the Department of Health. Of all COVID cases in Hawaii, Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders make up about 40% of the COVID cases. That's almost half. Hawaiians are 24% of the population. Pacific Islanders that are not Hawaiian are even less. And yet we were almost half of the COVID cases. And and us combined, I believe, is about almost 8%. Only 8% of us have been vaccinated. And one of the major issues with people who continue to come to Hawaii is that during the pandemic, especially, people have been coming here, tourists have been coming here and then getting vaccinated ahead of us. Americans have been able to come to Hawaii and then somehow get vaccinated. And it was a huge scandal when it was reported in the news that Americans were flying to Hawaii as tourists and then getting vaccinated and then enjoying their vacation, because Hawaii is supposed to have that 10-day quarantine, which used to be 14, and now it's just 10 because they want to let people go out and play. And the idea is that, well, before you come to Hawaii, you either have to take a COVID test to make sure you're negative, or you just fly and then you quarantine. But the problem with that is that the people who are testing and the people who didn't test are flying on the same planes. And so they're even if they tested negative for COVID before, they get to Hawaii and they may have caught it on the plane. And so that continues to bring COVID into our communities. And because of the low medical access, those of us who are working these frontline jobs in the tourism industry, who work in the hotels, who serve these people who come to us, who come to visit our islands, we're the ones catching COVID. We're the ones dying from it. We're the ones who go to the hospital and then, or worse, don't have access to a hospital. On some islands, such as Molokai, like I mentioned earlier, or some of the really rural islands, there's barely any ICU units. There's barely any ER units.
There's an island where you can't go if you're not Native Hawaiian, right?
So that's called Ni'ihau. Basically, that island, the population's kind of low, but yes, basically, you can only go if you're invited, or if you live there before.
And you can't surf on the north shore of Oahu, right? If you're a white boy, you can't surf on the north shore of Oahu?
Oh, no, you definitely can. Well, if you look at the north shore, so real quick, Ni'ihau is actually owned by a white family called the Robinsons. They bought it, and then they bought, like, similar to Lanai, Larry Ellison, I forget what company he owns. I think it's like Virgin or something like that. He owns Lanai. Like, this billionaire owns the entire island. They let him buy it. It's ridiculous. But the north shore of Oahu is, unfortunately, it's very famous for its surf. It's a very small seaside community. It's unfortunately one of the most heavily gentrified areas in Hawaii. If you look along the coastline, it's huge houses owned by rich millionaires and billionaires and people who move here to raise their families. And a lot of it's white people now. It's horrible because these very important areas to Hawaiians that once housed thriving, diverse communities have now become predominantly white and are pushing out local people and pushing us into other marginalized areas. The west side of Oahu is called an area called Wai'anae, or the Wai'anae Coast. It is the most heavily populated area of Hawaiians anywhere in the world. And it is one of the most impoverished areas in the entire Hawaiian Islands. We obviously used to be spread out. Like I said, there used to be about 1 million Hawaiians. now we're just starting to get back to like half that, around 500,000. If you look at where people used to live, it was very evenly spread out throughout the islands. And now it's predominantly concentrated on one coast, on one island.
It's great. I mean, and it's just these are places, Puerto Rico and Hawaii, and we didn't mention we kind of mentioned Guam and Samoa and all of our other colonized brothers, islanders. These places were self-sufficient. The Kingdom of Hawaii was rich, The same thing about India. Like we think about India that it's poor, but India was the richest country in the world, like richer than England, richer than anything. Puerto Rico is called Rich Port. That tells you what kind of place it was. And they grew on both islands. They grew everything. They provided for themselves, and now they can't provide for themselves. And now there's all these problems. And now it's almost sad when you read about Hawaii in 1800s. It's so beautiful. It just sounds so beautiful, and the ecological diversity and the purity. Like you love Hawaii, but you can never even imagine what it was like before the missionaries came. Yeah,
and one of the things, even like the kingdom had a lot of problems. The Hawaiian, unfortunately, were going through something of a population apocalypse with our population dropping. And in amidst that crisis, we were able to not only establish mandatory education. We were one of the most literate populations of the planet. Literacy was universal. At the time in the United States, at the same time, they still were, one, enslaving people, and two, they had maybe a 70% literacy rate. Today, the U.S. still has a lower literacy rate than the Hawaiian Kingdom did at the time. Not only that, the Hawaiian Kingdom had hundreds of newspapers. We had colored color print images newspapers before the United States did, and we had electricity in the White House our Palace before the White House.
That's right.
So when people come in and are like, America brought you civilization, they brought you education, they brought you wealth. We had that before them. We were richer then than we are now. And the Puerto Rico, it's the same thing. Yeah. These islands that are owned by the U.S., the constant lie that's told to us is we need America, we need America, we need America. And they come offering these like concessions to us that, well, you know what? We own you, but here, we'll give you this so that way you're okay. But what we know as like a universal rule as colonized people is when white men come to your shore and offer you something, it's a lie because they're afraid of you realizing what you can really have.
Right. I mean, it's you always think about like what would have happened if the Puerto Ricans, as soon as they saw the first white ship coming, they say, nope, you can't get on. Yep. Those people the Hawaiians who killed James Cook, they were right. If they would have kept doing that, things would have been better. Yeah. I mean, same thing happened in Puerto Rico. The first, like after James Cook came, in the first century after he came, the Hawaiian population like decreased by like 60%, something like that.
Yep.
And same thing happened in Puerto Rico. And it's so where's the independence movement now? Like you guys are a state. Is there a chance you guys could become independent? I mean, it looks like the white capitalists really, really want your fucking island. They look like they have it, man. Money talks.
So we have a saying in Hawaii, and it goes back to when they overthrew our country. This man, one of the Hawaiian independence organizers and activists and leaders, wrote in the newspaper. He gave a speech, and he said, "Ahiki ke aloha aina hope loa." Basically, it says, basically the phrase is "until the last aloha aina." And aloha aina is a phrase we use that means love the land, but it also is descriptive of people, like loyalists to the land, people who, it's similar, like the idea of patriots, but different because it's not connected to it's connected to the land. It's a little bit different, but basically same idea.
That's the motto of Hawaii, isn't it?
No, the motto is which is the sovereignty, which is funny that the state uses it because it's a line from the kingdom and it means the sovereignty of the land is perpetuated in righteousness. And it's funny because the state of Hawaii is currently the thing that is impeding the sovereignty of the Hawaiian Islands. Right. But ahiki ke aloha aina hope loa means until the last aloha aina. And basically the phrase was uttered saying that until the last Hawaiian is gone, the fight for independence goes on. So long as one of us lives, we have the chance. And so one of the things I've been telling a lot of Puerto Ricans who are very afraid of statehood is like, yes, you need to fight statehood as hard as you can, get independent. But if somehow statehood happens, because America seems to always find a way to make colonialism happen, the fight doesn't end there. Because as so long as there are Puerto Ricans who believe in independence, the fight will still be there, because the chance for decolonization doesn't end when they've incorporated you into their country. I mean, the British Empire did the same thing. They had all their territories and colonies, and the British Empire fell. And every empire in history has collapsed. Yeah. And America's empire is no different, because it's run by a military that overextends itself wildly and continues to profit off the suffering and the exploitation of its lower classes. And so long as that is the method of that empire to continue on, it'll inevitably fail forward and doom itself to extinction.
Yeah, I mean,
in Hawaii, the reason we believe that we can still be independent is because, well, for many reasons. One, every empire falls, and so long as America continues this collapse of itself around capitalism, of overspending on its military and then not caring for its own people back home, of not caring for people's education or welfare or anything like that, their days are numbered, because they're going to continue exploiting their own people until suddenly people can't take it anymore. And the American military continues to overextend itself in Hawaii and Asia. And so in Hawaii, independence isn't just something that'll benefit us. It's a responsibility we have to get our liberation and independence, because of the way the U.S. military utilizes us as a base for its imperialism in the Pacific. If Hawaii gets free, America has a much harder time holding Samoa. It has a much harder time holding Guam. It has a much harder time exploiting people in the Philippines and in Okinawa and in every other place around the Pacific and Asia. Hawaii, one of the things it constantly is used for is a training area for the U.S. military and its allies. One of those allies is the Indonesian military, which is currently committing genocide in West Papua of Black Pacific Islanders. They're genociding this population. Indonesia is occupying them, and they're using Hawaiian land as a training ground for these genocidal troops. So independence for us isn't just yes, it is absolutely a better future for Hawaiians and everybody in Hawaii. It's a chance for us to determine our own future, because our past was robbed from us by white colonizers. But also, it's this responsibility we have to get free, because our independence and liberation means a step toward liberation and independence and the reduction of imperialism being enacted upon our brothers and sisters across the Pacific and in other colonized places. Yeah,
I mean, goddamn, man, you are articulate like a motherfucker. Like, that is exactly, I mean, it's beautiful. I mean, the thing you said about empires, yeah, I mean, it's funny how America thinks that it's not going to fall. Every empire thinks it's not going to fall. Like, you know, in Great Britain, it was famously the empire that the sun never set on, right? And now nobody talks about Great Britain. You know, we're not worried about England. We're worried about China, right? But and then the other thing about manifest destiny, like you said, like America took Hawaii, because in American history, they teach us a manifest destiny that we were supposed to. America, I don't know why I'm saying we. America wanted to extend all the way to the California coast. That's a lie. Manifest destiny was the white Americans thinking, no, we're going to take Hawaii, then we're going to take Japan, then we're going to take China, we're going to wrap around the whole fucking world.
Yeah, they wanted a global empire.
Yeah. And but it's going to fall. All empires fall, and Hawaii should get ready for that day, because it's coming, man. It's just coming. Yep. And I'm not even praying for the downfall of American empire. It's just what happens. An empire can't last for long. So, I mean, one day Hawaii will be free, and one day Puerto Rico will be free, and hopefully that day is sooner rather than later, man. Thank you so much. Let everybody know, like, where they can find you on Twitter. I follow you on Twitter, but let everybody know where they can find you and read more about what's going on in Hawaii.
Yeah. So if you want to follow me on Twitter, I'm at Ku'e Kawena. So KUE_Kawena, KAWENA. You can find me on Twitter or on Instagram as well as Angry Hawaiian. And if you follow me, you'll get a bunch of other resources to learn about Hawaii and the independence movement here. That's basically all I post about. And then there are lots of other resources out there for you to learn about it. So definitely keep an eye out for those things.
It's been interesting and exciting, this whole growing allyship between Puerto Ricans and Hawaiians, huh?
Yeah. I mean, it's one of the best things that happened in 2021 thus far. And I think, and I'm hoping that it continues, because our struggles are so similar. And I think that, especially because Puerto Ricans continue to hear the idea of Hawaii being the ideal future for Puerto Rico, it's our duty as Hawaiians to not only reject that false notion, but also stand alongside Puerto Ricans and say that, no, we don't want this for you. We want you to have a better future, and we're willing to fight alongside you against the Americans who will continue to gentrify and harm your communities.
Very beautiful, man. Thank you so much for coming on, man. Free Hawaii, man. I say free Hawaii.
Free Puerto Rico.
Free Puerto Rico. Thanks, bro. Have a good weekend.
You too. Aloha.